A new kind of war is being waged on the high seas, and luxury yacht owners have become the primary target of an apex predator that is no longer just curious about boats. It is systematically dismantling them by attacking the rudder with tactical precision from a coordinated pod. And the question marine biologists are scrambling to answer is whether this is a calculated revenge mission tied to past trauma or a learned cultural fad spreading through the matriarchal line of a critically endangered population. Between 2020 and the present, a small and well-studied subpopulation of orcas known to researchers as the Iberian striped subpopulation began changing how it interacts with vessels in ways that captains, sailing clubs, and the marine biology community had never seen at this scale before. And the pattern is so consistent and so anatomically specific that scientists have stopped calling it chance curiosity and started describing it as a coordinated object handling tradition. We are going to walk through 5 parts that explain exactly what changed, how the attacks actually unfold on the water, the trauma hypothesis around a specific older female called white gladdies, what orca culture tells us about how this behavior can persist, and what it all means for the future of human and orca coexistence in crowded European waters. The orcas in question belong to what researchers call the Iberian striped subpopulation, sometimes called the Iberian Peninsula killer whales, and they are a genetically distinct and critically endangered group with approximately 40 individuals estimated as of the most recent peer-reviewed surveys, mostly found along the coasts of Spain and Portugal, along the Strait of Gibraltar, and along the Atlantic seaboard of the Iberian Peninsula. They are tracked year-round by marine biologists associated with several Spanish and Portuguese research institutions, and individual orcas have been photo-identified over decades by their distinct saddle patch patterns, by their eye pigmentation differences, and by the unique nicks on their dorsal fins. Their diet is predominantly bluefin tuna, with seasonal shifts toward other prey species during parts of the year, and their sociality is strongly matrilineal in the same pattern that has been documented for resident and transient orcas in the Pacific, and for Type through Type D orcas in the Southern Hemisphere. What became widely reported from 2020 onward is a striking change in how this subpopulation interacts with vessels. Researchers who had tracked these orcas for decades had recorded only occasional curious approaches to boats, but beginning around 2020 and accelerating through 2022 and 2023, an increasing cluster of reports documented pods actively approaching small and mid-sized sailing vessels, focusing on the rudder, and in some cases, inflicting enough damage to disable steering entirely. By the spring of 2023, the volume of incidents had become impossible to ignore, with multiple sailing clubs in the region issuing revised guidance to skippers, and with insurance providers quietly updating their underwriting assumptions for vessels operating in the affected corridors. The first of our 5 parts covers what marine biologists have learned about the anatomy of the attacks, and what the targeting pattern tells us about what the orcas are actually doing when they close on a vessel. The interactions follow a recognizable pattern that skippers describe with surprising consistency. Pods approach a sailing vessel from astern or from the side, often at relatively slow cruising speed, and home in on the rudder rather than on any other part of the hull. They typically make contact with the leading edge of the rudder, sometimes biting the rudder surface, sometimes ramming it, often from coordinated angles that suggest a deliberate plan rather than agitation or play. Multiple individuals take turns, which alone tells scientists that this is not a single rogue animal, but a group behavior with some kind of social coordination. And the approach is sometimes described by witnesses as deliberate and unhurried, rather than agitated or territorial in the way a normal close encounter would feel. The animals that participate range from juveniles to large adult females, though the cohort's interaction frequency is biased towards specific matrilines that researchers have come to identify through long-running photo identification work. So the behavior is not evenly distributed across the whole subpopulation, but concentrated in particular family groups. The targeting of the rudder is functionally significant in a way that bow or hull contact would not be. A sailing vessel without functional steering is in serious navigational trouble, especially in tidal waters or busy shipping lanes near Gibraltar. And the rudder is also a structurally exposed and comparatively damageable component. So orcas aiming for it are aiming for a part of the boat where a small amount of force causes a disproportionately large loss of function. Iberian subpopulation reports indicate that damage to rudders, to steering systems, and to the lower transom area accounts for the overwhelming majority of reported vessel interaction outcomes, with occasional reports of damaged keel components, and more rarely still reports of hull breaches on smaller sailing vessels. The vessel types most frequently involved are mid-sized sailing yachts in the 8 to 15-meter range, predominantly recreational and charter boats rather than commercial vessels, and there are documented interactions with motor yachts in the literature, but they are rarer and tend to follow a different shape, typically a brief approach and withdrawal rather than sustained physical interaction with the rudder. The vessel size effect has been noted by several research teams and is consistent with the hypothesis that the behavior is anchored in a particular prey handling or object handling tradition, rather than in a generalized anti-vessel hostility that would affect all boat types equally. Severity outcomes range widely in the documented incidents. Many encounters end with the Orcas withdrawing after minor rudder contact, with the vessel able to proceed under sail with reduced maneuverability or under motor to the nearest port for repairs. Others leave the vessel dead in the water, requiring tow by a commercial salvage vessel or a Coast Guard rescue. And a small number of incidents have involved partial sinking, almost always on smaller sailing yachts where rudder damage compounded pre-existing vulnerabilities like aging through hull fittings or thin hull laminate. The second part of this story dives into the trauma hypothesis, centered on a specific older female orca called White Gladys, named for distinctive pale saddle patch pattern that was first logged in identification catalogs decades ago, and that has since become iconic in this corner of marine research. Within the research community, the most prominent single-actor hypothesis circulates around White Gladys as the originator of the matrilene-wide vessel rudder tradition. And the hypothesis was first proposed by marine biologist Alfredo Lopes Fernandez of the University of Aveiro in Portugal, along with his colleagues. The mechanism the hypothesis proposes is that White Gladys suffered a traumatic encounter with a vessel, most often speculated to be a collision with a boat or an entanglement with fishing gear, and that this painful initial experience primed a learned antagonism toward vessels in general in this one individual animal. Once primed, the hypothesis continues. White Gladys's matrilene members adopted the behavior through social learning, with the older animal teaching younger orcas the rudder strike tactic through the kind of matriarchal teaching that has been documented in other orca populations for hunting and for play behaviors. The behavior then radiated outward through the wider subpopulation through repeated encounters between related family groups, eventually producing the multipod pattern that researchers are documenting today across hundreds of incidents. The hypothesis is plausible and well-respected in the marine biology community, but it is, importantly, a hypothesis and not a confirmed mechanism, because direct evidence that White Gladys suffered a specific vessel-related injury that triggered a particular behavioral change has not been published in the peer-reviewed literature so far. Lopes Fernandez and other researchers have pointed to White Gladys as the most likely individual at the origin of the practice, partly because she is one of the older adult females in the subpopulation, and partly because the timing of her leading role in vessel interactions matches the period in which the behavior became prominent across the wider group. Research into cetacean social structure supports the second half of the hypothesis, regardless of whether the first half is exactly correct in every detail. Because orcas live in strongly matrilineal social structures with knowledge and behavior, transmitted across generations through mother-led teaching rather than through genetic inheritance alone. Older females, especially post-reproductive matriarchs, are known to play outsized roles in pod decision-making. They lead hunts, mediate conflicts between family members, and are believed to be the primary carriers of ecological knowledge in many orca populations studied in the wild. Other researchers have cautioned that there are alternative explanations that should be on the table at the same time, including the possibility that the behavior may be purely opportunistic object play in a population that has more leisure time, that it may be tied to year-class changes in prey distribution that bring the orcas into more frequent contact with vessels, or that it may be a response to chronic stress from elevated vessel traffic in their preferred foraging corridors. Analysis published in 2022 in the peer-reviewed marine biology literature was careful to characterize the trauma hypothesis as plausible and noteworthy, with the explicit caveat that more direct evidence is needed before the mechanism can be presented as anything stronger than one of several candidates. Some commentators in the popular press have overstated the hypothesis, presenting it as established fact, and this overstatement has helped drive the meme version of the revenge orca narrative online, which is not what the underlying research actually claims, and which has distorted public perception of how cautious the scientists themselves are being in their published conclusions. The third part of this story is about orca culture and social learning more broadly, which is the framework that makes the whole pattern scientifically coherent rather than mysterious. Orcas are among the most culturally complex non-human animals documented by science, and different ecotypes in different ocean basins, resident and transient and offshore, plus type A through type D in the southern hemisphere, all show distinctive prey preferences, vocal dialects, hunting techniques, and even beach rubbing or play behaviors that are not genetic in origin, but are transmitted through social learning across generations. The classic example is the behavior of temporarily beaching themselves to catch seals, observed in a small number of subantarctic populations, but not others. Another famous example is the use of cooperative wave washing to knock prey off ice floes in regions where this technique reliably works. These behaviors are not encoded in genes that are passed down through reproduction. They are passed down through matrilineal teaching and reinforced by repeated practice over many years within a family line, which is what makes orca culture genuinely analogous to human culture in some respects, and not metaphorically in others. This cultural dimension is central to interpreting the vessel interaction phenomenon, because researchers studying orca behavior have repeatedly stressed that explanations relying on simple instinct, on aggression, or on territorial defense are inadequate to explain a behavior that appears in one subpopulation, that targets a specific anatomical feature of a non-prey object, and that has been refined and transmitted across generations within that subpopulation. A more defensible reading of what is happening is that the subpopulation has acquired a local tradition of object interaction with sailing vessels, learned from one or more senior individuals, refined through repeated practice, and reinforced by the response of the boats themselves, which, in the worst cases, stop moving and abandon the area, providing a kind of behavioral outcome that the orcas may interpret as the interaction being successful. Historical examples of faddish behavior in other orca populations help frame the present case, because not every learned behavior persists forever and some are short-term fashion rather than durable cultural inheritance. There are documented instances of temporary trend behaviors, including the famous wearing dead salmon as hats in Pacific Northwest resident pods in the late 1980s. That propagated rapidly through social learning, lasted for weeks or a few months, and then faded when the novelty wore off. Other behaviors, like the specific hunting techniques used by resident pods in particular coastal regions, are more durable and have been transmitted across decades through multiple generations of mother-daughter teaching with little variation. The vessel-rudder interaction in the Iberian subpopulation has now persisted for several years and shows no clear sign of fading away, which suggests it is not a short-term fad, but a more durable learned tradition that the matriarchs are continuing to teach to younger individuals each year. Why scientists view this behavior as learned rather than genetic is genuinely interesting. The behavior appeared in a small inbred population with low genetic variability for rapid genetic adaptation of this kind. The behavior is restricted to one subpopulation rather than spread across multiple populations that share a recent common ancestor. The behavior shows within pod variability and intensity that is consistent with social learning rather than with a uniform genetic disposition. And most importantly, the behavior is transmitted through an observed channel, matrilineal teaching, that is well documented in this species for many other behaviors. The fourth part covers what these encounters actually mean on the water for the humans involved, and the picture is more serious than the meme version of killer whales attacking boats suggests in many respects and less dramatic in others. The human cost of these encounters is real and growing, because the Iberian subpopulation's range overlaps with some of Europe's busiest recreational sailing corridors, particularly around the Strait of Gibraltar, the Atlantic coast of southern Spain and Portugal, and increasingly along the Galician coast and beyond as the behavior spreads within the subpopulation's traditional range. Recreational sailors in these waters have reported incidents ranging from mild to severe, and several sailor organizations have issued updated guidance recommending avoidance of particular corridors during certain seasons, and advising on hull materials and rudder design features that may be more resistant to the contact pattern researchers describe. The most common pattern reported by skippers is a slow approach, often described as feeling like a deliberate stalking rather than a chance encounter, followed by sustained contact with the rudder over a period ranging from minutes to over an hour in some of the more prolonged incidents on record. Sailing under motor in calm conditions with the rudder disabled is dangerous in tidal waters. In windier conditions, a sailing vessel can sometimes proceed under reduced sail with improvised steering using drift and trailing lines, but is highly vulnerable to commercial traffic and to weather changes in the meantime. Deterrent attempts have had mixed results so far, which is the honest summary of the practical literature. Acoustic deterrents and high-frequency pingers and low-frequency ship horns have produced responses that range from clearly aversive to indifferent depending on the individual orcas involved and the context. There is no reliably effective commercial deterrent documented in the published literature for this specific behavior. And one of the reasons this is so hard is that the behavior is socially reinforced within the pod, which means a deterrent that works on one individual may have no effect on the social transmission of the pattern. Some skippers have reported that stopping the vessel and shutting down propulsion reduces further engagement. Others have reported the opposite result. And there is anecdotal support for the idea that aggressive behavior by skippers may, in some cases, increase the intensity of the interaction rather than suppress it, which suggests the orcas are reading the response of the boat as part of the interaction itself. The regulatory balance is genuinely difficult to set, because Iberian orcas are a critically endangered subpopulation protected by both national and international law, and the marine protected areas that overlap with their range have explicit protections for the animals that would make any harmful intervention illegal. Any deterrent measure carries some risk of harming individual orcas, and any lethal measure is both illegal and would almost certainly backfire by removing the older females who are essential to the cultural transmission of the behavior. So the only problem-solving orientation that fits the evidence is the one that minimizes harm to both sides rather than picking a side to harm more. The fifth and final part of this story pulls back from the immediate incidents and looks at what the whole phenomenon tells us about how humans and orcas are likely to share the ocean in the decades ahead. Whatever the precise mechanism behind the vessel interactions, the phenomenon is a striking data point in the ongoing rethink of how this species processes its environment, and it adds to a body of evidence that has been growing for decades. Orcas have already been documented as highly intelligent, culturally rich, socially complex, and capable of fine-grained transmission of learned behaviors across generations. The fact that this particular subpopulation has rapidly refined a tactic against recreational vessels in a specific anatomical targeting pattern is consistent with that broader picture and adds a sharp detail to it. The orcas are not just learning about their environment, they are learning about specific features of human technology in a way that lets them dismantle parts of it under field conditions. A serious concern in the research community right now is the possibility that the behavior could spread to other orca populations, because orcas' interpod contact does occur through overlapping ranges and through transient individuals that move between pods. And while the cultural transmission literature suggests behaviors are largely stable within matrilines, examples of cross-pod transmission do exist in the literature and cannot be ruled out as a future risk. If the vessel rudder tradition were ever to spread outside the Iberian subpopulation, the implications for global shipping and recreational boating would be considerably larger than they are today and could affect routes and insurance models all over the world. These events also challenge long-standing assumptions about human control in marine environments, because the traditional framing in which humans are the overwhelmingly dominant force and other marine species are predictable resources breaks down when a small, persistent population of animals can systematically disrupt a particular human activity at the level of individual boats and individual harbors. The interesting question from a marine policy perspective is not whether this is good or bad for any particular stakeholder, but whether it is expected. And marine biologists have been warning for decades that intelligent marine mammals in heavily trafficked waters are likely to develop learned responses to the human presence, including responses that are not narrowly in the human interest. The leading scientific theories converge on a small set of explanations, none of which is mutually exclusive, so the actual cause may be a combination rather than a clean single mechanism. Trauma plus social learning centered around white gladdies generalized object play and exploration under novel conditions, a response to long-elevated vessel traffic levels, and possibly a learned association between vessels and disrupted foraging, or an emergent property of how the subpopulation now spends time in particular corridors, shared with recreational sailing. In the longer frame, this is one more example of a marine mammal population teaching us that our behavior in shared waters has consequences we did not anticipate, and that those consequences can come back at us through the cultural learning of intelligent animals, in ways our risk management models were not designed to anticipate. So the only durable answer is the kind of management that treats the orcas as active participants in the system, rather than as a fixed biological backdrop to human activity. If this shifted how you think about a meme you have seen before, the next video goes deep into the Byzantine Empire and the half-Saracen general whose shadow logistics won the First Crusade. So tap through and watch that one next.